Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to World Arbitration Update. This is our third annual conference. My name is Ian Laird. I am co-founder and co-chair of the conference, along with my colleague, Dr. Jose Antonio Rivas. And we're very pleased to start day 3 of this year's conference with a topic that generates a great deal of interest concerning arbitration in the Middle East region and North Africa. And we have an excellent panel today on the topic of the Abraham Accords, arbitration of disputes involving Israel and the MENA region. And I have the real pleasure today of introducing the moderator of our panel, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about World Arbitration Update. We founded it to provide a forum outside the usual and international centers of arbitration to reflect the truly international nature of international arbitration. We've organized the conference over 6 days this year to cover every region of the world, and part of the mandate of the conference is to provide updates on recent developments from all those different regions. And an example this year was we started the first 2 days of the conference in Mexico, and we were very grateful and pleased to work with and cooperate with the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, and worked together on the Mexico City investment arbitration days, which were very successful. Over the first 2 days of the conference in Mexico City, we had over 950 participants in person and virtually. It was a great success, and we look forward to continuing the rest of this week and kicking it off with this great session. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session. It's Nir Tiedar, and he's a partner at Kornitzky Company in Tel Aviv. Nir specializes in complex international arbitrations, representing clients in proceedings under various arbitral body rules, as well as in ad hoc proceedings. As many of you know, Kornitzky is regularly ranked tier 1 and as a top international arbitration firm. And his experience in particular spans a range of industry sectors, including construction, energy, and natural resources, banking, financial services, insurance, and M&A. It's a really great pleasure to have you here this morning, Nir, and I'll pass over the microphone and we'll get our session started. Really looking forward to this fantastic topic. Thanks very much, and let's go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian. Very excited to be here and welcome everyone to this, what will hopefully be a very interesting panel. We have today with us a varied and interesting panel of experts who will take us through very varied and interesting aspects that have to do with the Abraham Accords. So what we'll have is, I'll start off with a very short introduction, but then we'll turn it off to the people who will be making the presentations. So we have with us Paul Hughes, who's a partner at Cobra and Kim's Dubai office. He has over 10 years of experience in Dubai, focusing on complex cross-border claims with a nexus to the UAE and the Middle East in a wider sense. He has extensive experience in enforcement of judgments in arbitral awards, fraud investigations, and contentious shareholder disputes. And Cobra and Kim has offices in Dubai and Tel Aviv, which makes it uniquely placed to deal with matters that have to do with the Abraham Accords. Paul will focus on the Abraham Accords more generally and will focus on his areas of expertise in terms of cross-border litigation, arbitration, and enforcement, and how those tie into the Abraham Accords. We also have with us Stewart Neuberger, who's a senior partner at the international law firm Crowell Moring. He's developed their international dispute practice before the US courts, as well as deals with international commercial and treaty-based arbitrations. Prior to joining the firm 34 years ago, he served as the U.S. Attorney's Office. He served in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., representing the U.S. government in criminal and civil matters. He taught at Georgetown Law and lectured at school and bar programs around the world. And very interestingly, the author of The Forgotten Flight, which tells a story of his pursuit of Libya and Colonel Gaddafi for blowing up the UTA Flight 772 in 1989. Stu will focus specifically on a less frequently talked about aspect of the Abraham Accords, which is Sudan, and how it ties into the Abraham Accords and how it made its way into them. Last but certainly not least, we have Professor Ari Ziv. He's a professor at Bar-Ilan Law University, formerly the Dean of the Faculty of Law, and presently the Vice Rector. He specializes in international economic law, EU law, arbitration, and energy law, and has authored over 50 academic books and articles on topics ranging from international trade and investment law, national arbitration, public procurement law, EU law, competition law, and torts. He's the president of the International Academy of Commercial and Consumer Law, a member of the ICSID panel of conciliators and arbitrators, and has served as the president of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration. He's also sat as a member of 7 different WTO dispute settlement panels and trades involving various countries such as the US, EU, China, Russia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Professor Reich will focus here today on the bill to adopt the UNCITRAL model law in Israel and the dispute over the maritime border with Lebanon, and how these two things potentially impact the Abraham Accords in a wider sense and the Middle East more generally. So before turning over to the panelists, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Abraham Accords more generally. So first of all, when we say the Abraham Accords, what do we mean? So they are generally, the phrase is generally used to refer collectively to a set of agreements between Israel and several countries, including the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and interestingly for me, and this I noticed today reading a little bit more about the Abraham Accords, Kosovo, which is often bunched in together with the Abraham Accords countries. And now these accords are interesting because these aren't countries that have been in military conflict, but for many, many years, there was a state of no official relationships, even to the extent of an economic boycott of Israel by many of these states, and economic and other links between Israel and the Abraham Accord states were limited, if at all, and indirect. And so the Accords essentially is collectively a set of agreements, or is an agreement and additional steps that deal with the normalization, peace, diplomatic relations, and economic normalization between the countries. Now, just for example, one of the very first steps the UAE took following the Accords, for example, was to repeal what was then called as the Israeli boycott law. And anyone who's done business in the UAE prior to that will know that standard contracts in the UAE often had anti-Israel, anti-dealing with Israel provisions, etc. So the normalization of economic ties essentially led directly to the possibility of economic ties between Israel and the UAE and the rest of the Abraham Accord countries. And following those agreements, Israel has relatively quickly pursued additional agreement with those Abraham Accord states, leading with the UAE. There is now a free trade agreement, which is in force between Israel and the UAE. There is, importantly, a bilateral investment treaty protecting mutual investments between Israel and the UAE. And just as an aside, for anyone who's interested in investment protection law and the drafting of BITs, I think it's a very interesting BIT to read for various reasons. And I've heard an official from the Israeli Ministry of Justice say that it was actually negotiated in a week, And for anyone who knows how international agreements are usually negotiated, will appreciate how unusually quick that is. There are additional very useful agreements that are a part of the normalization of the relationships and the practical effects of them. So, for example, things that have to do with recognition of driver's licenses, customs cooperations, the ability to carry out direct flights and directly make a phone call. These were things that only a few years ago were impossible. Now, one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons it's important that we're having this panel today, is that they aren't just these. The Abraham Accords is not only a set of political or diplomatic agreements. These are agreements which have a very, very practical, mostly economic, but not only impact. And I'll just, before handing over to the panelists, I will just quickly share and hopefully everyone can see this. I'll just share a very small set of economic indicators that can just set the scene a little bit onto the impact and importance of the Abraham Accords. So these are data that were essentially taken from the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, comparing total trade between Israel and the Abraham Accord countries between 2019 and 2022. And by the way, there are already first indicators that 2023 is showing additional increase. So you can see that the increase between just under $600 million of trade in 2019 to almost $3.5 billion of trade in 2022. And that is also shown in the import-export balance. So there is much more import to Israel from Abraham Accord countries than export, but both imports and exports between Israel and the Abraham Accord countries have increased very significantly. If you compare 2019 and 2020 to 2022, the increase is very, very significant. These statistics isolate from that the Israel-UAE trade. And I think what's very clear from this is not only the huge increase in the trade between Israel and the UAE, but also how significant the Israel-UAE trade is as a part of the Abraham Accord. So when we looked at the previous statistics, it is clear that a very large part of that is the trade between Israel and the UAE. And the last statistic I will share is just in terms of tourists. So the statistics are showing a very significant outflow of tourists between Israel and the Abraham Accord countries, a less significant increase in the tourism between the Abraham Accord countries and Israel. But if you're looking at the increase in terms of tourists outgoing from Israel, so obviously there was a small decrease because of COVID, but then very, very quickly an increase which is dramatic from under 30,000 to almost 500,000 in 2022. And that goes together with the fact that you no longer need a visa and there are direct flights. And I think anyone who knows Israel knows that almost everyone from Israel has now visited the UAE. And it's just been one of the more common and loved places to visit and to be in. So having said that, I'll turn over to Paul.
Thank you, Nir. And I echo everything you said there. Is having done the flight between Dubai and Tel Aviv 5 times in the last 12 months, I can vouch that there's a lot. Israelis love coming here. I've also tried a couple of the kosher restaurants here. Could do with a little improvements on that side, but it's still great that we actually have them, of course. Today, I'm going to focus more on the economic benefits I'm going to touch upon the economic benefits of the Abraham Accords between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And then I'm going to talk about potential enforcement issues that arise out of the Abraham Accords and how this will potentially increase the use of arbitration in cross-border commercial disputes between Israel and not just the UAE, but the region as a whole. And then I'm just going to cover some of the practical impacts of the Abraham Accords on the smooth and efficient running of cross-border arbitrations involving the two states. Now, as Nia just pointed out, trade between the two countries, Israel and the UAE, has been growing since the Accords were signed in September 2020. And then this was enhanced following the signing of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, last year. And this provides for unprecedented economic benefits for both countries. It provides greater market access for UAE products entering the Israeli market, and provides for an open and non-discriminatory environment for all cross-border trade with Israel. In particular, the key industries are finance, transport, communications, and along with establishing rules on digital trade and the protection of IP rights. Israel's very much a tech hub, and the UAE is growing into becoming its own tech hub in the Middle East as well. As Nia pointed out, so bilateral trade, it's currently at 2.59 billion in 2022, but that's a jump of 109.7% from the year before. And interestingly, the UAE is now the 16th largest trading partner of Israel out of 126 countries, which is, it's such a great improvement if you consider 3, 4, 5 years ago. And the two countries, they have quite lofty ambitions. They want to cross the 10 billion threshold in bilateral trade in the coming years. Now, significant levels of investment, as most people on this call will know, tend to lead into an uptick in disputes and investigations. Often when there's a high level of foreign direct investment, you have a honeymoon period, and then eventually there are breakdowns between the parties. And really, it's those commercial parties, now leaving aside the bit, but the commercial parties engaging in this increased level of trade, they need to know the mechanics of how a dispute between an Israeli and an Emirati company will be resolved. And without that certainty, without the certainty of long-term cross-border dispute resolution mechanisms, without them knowing that the contract or the SPA they're entering into, or the joint venture, without knowing that they can ultimately turn that to cash if it goes wrong, then the lofty ambitions for bilateral trade may not actually be ultimately realized. Now, given other than the bit, there's an absence of bilateral treaty on recognition and enforcement of court judgments. So for me, arbitration is likely to be the main beneficiary when it comes to any disputes arising out of this influx in foreign investment and the Accords, given essentially Israel and the UAE are both signatories to the New York Convention. And I'll come back to the enforcement of arbitration awards in a second, but just to touch upon the enforcement of court judgments. The enforcement situation on court judgments looks difficult, but not necessarily insurmountable. There is a growing trend in the UAE to recognize foreign judgments as long as they meet the requirements of reciprocity between the jurisdictions. Our Israeli colleagues on the panel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the same position, it's the same position in Israel as well. You need to show that reciprocity. In fact, it's only really recently that during the last 12 months, in fact, that the UAE courts have agreed to enforce an English judgment, and that was following a reciprocal enforcement of the UAE judgment in the United Kingdom. We, as a firm, we recently, in January this year, we had an English judgment recognised in the UAE for a New York counterparty, and that process was actually very smooth, which you just wouldn't have seen that 5, 6 years ago. So there are potential options there for the mutual enforcement of judgments between Israel and the UAE. Whether a bilateral treaty on enforcement will follow for commercial parties remains to be seen. Now, enforcement of arbitration laws should be more straightforward, given both states are signatories to the New York Convention and both with developed laws, arbitration laws. Now, the New York Convention applies in both the civil onshore courts. I'm just taking a step back. For those who don't know, the UAE, like the majority of the Middle East, is a civil law jurisdiction, and the primary language is Arabic. You have to have, the certain qualifications, mainly being Emirati, to practice in the local Dubai court. But within the UAE, you have two separate jurisdictions that have their own courts. You have the Dubai International Financial Centers, which is just outside my window here, and the Abu Dhabi Global Markets in Abu Dhabi. They both have a common law court system, just applying to this area that you can see just before the road, and it applies in this area, and it's staffed by judges from common law countries, so England, Scotland, Australia, even Malaysia, and also some local Emirati judges as well. So you have this dual system here, but the important thing to note is that the New York Convention will apply in both, and both have their own arbitration laws. And where I see this ability to be able to enforce in the UAE as a potential game changer for Israeli award holders and maybe even judgment holders, it's a game changer for that enforcement across the whole Middle East, because there are systems available here. But I'll give you an example. So an Israeli award creditor could, for example, have its award recognized in a DIFC as an initial step, because you just take advantage of the arbitration-friendly nature of that jurisdiction. Very smooth process, ex-party recognition order. And then, if successful, that Israeli party would in fact hold a recognition order of the UAE courts. And then they could look at using the fact that you have a UAE court order to enforce across the Middle East and North Africa, say, for example, through the Riyadh Convention. Now, the Riyadh Convention is from 1983, and it's a regional treaty that reinforces judicial cooperation between around 20 Arab countries, and it allows for reciprocal enforcement of judgments across North Africa and the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia all the way to Morocco. Now, the Israeli award creditor you may think, well, if they're New York Convention signatories, then why would you go that route? Well, as I'm sure some of our Israeli colleagues are aware, the New York Convention route against counterparties in states such as Jordan. So Jordan's a signatory to the Riyadh Convention, but they've carved out enforcement by an Israeli party under that convention. And again, as people on this panel may know, there are other Middle Eastern states whose local courts will refuse to recognize an Israeli award at local level, despite the New York Convention. So you may have a situation where the Israeli award creditor prefers a route to the DIFC and then uses the Riyadh Convention to then enforce onwards from there. I don't think it's never been tried, but it's definitely a possibility, and the laws are there to allow that. So the way we see it, the Accords not only open up Israelis to the enforcement of awards and potential judgments in the UAE, and to other Abraham Accord signatories, but potentially shows that route to enforcement right across the Middle East and North Africa, and to countries who are not signatories, nor may they ever be signatories to the Accords. So I thought that's an interesting potential route there. The last thing I wanted to touch upon was really just the practical impact of the Accords. And some of this it's not rocket science, it's very basic, but effectively many of the barriers to the efficient running of arbitrations are now being removed. The most obvious one being the ability to actually fly into each other's countries to attend hearings, attend settlement meetings, or what have you. Countries are only 3 hours away from each other, so that's makes a big difference, and it means you're less likely to have to hold a hearing in a neutral country. But then, when it comes to the UAE arbitrations, despite it being a convention signatory and despite it having its own arbitration laws fairly developed, they still have nuances here. So, for example, the arbitration award, it needs to be notarized or legalized. Any kind of papers in support of arbitration enforcement needs to have that legalization of documents, which sounds very boring, but it can render your award unenforceable. So being able to now have UAE notaries approving powers of attorney from Israelis or other issues around legalization is actually a big step. I mean, take the power of attorney. If an Israeli can't get a power of attorney to engage a local Emirati lawyer, then it makes it very difficult to do anything in the courts here. That itself has changed as well, along with the Accords. And then finally, there were issues, and again, the panel probably experienced this in other Middle Eastern countries, but there's always historically been issues relating to the appointment of arbitrators or even counsel. So prior to the Accords, parties may have found it difficult to find Arab arbitrators or even local firms who are willing to participate in an arbitration involving Israeli parties. And I understand it still persists in non-Accord Middle Eastern states, causing no end of procedural issues. But for now, I think that the Accords have really impacted in a positive way the actual running of arbitrations. Nir, that's all I was going to say about that. I don't know if you want to. We'll do some questions at the end. I think that's the plan. Unless any of the panel have a question for me.
No, thank you for that, and maybe that's a good opportunity to say that I hope that participants can send us questions via the chat function. So if I'll see that, or someone else from the organizers will see a question, then we can try to address it. And Professor Reich, I don't know if you want to add to anything we just heard. I just wanted to mention maybe a couple of things that might be relevant. First of all, I think in terms of enforcement of potentially UAE or other Iran Court countries' judgments in Israel. So there's, as you mentioned, there's no specific international agreement to support that. In terms of Israeli law, the requirements would generally be, the main issue would generally be one of reciprocity, which sounds similar to the UAE. But I think the interesting thing in Israel, and maybe hearing what Paul said, it would be easier to do it at least the first time in Israel than in the UAE, is that there's recent judgment from the last few years of the Israeli courts that have really made a strong presumption in terms of in favor of reciprocity. So the need to positively prove that they were enforced already is a relatively low one. You would need to show that they would be generally enforced. So hopefully, if and when that time comes, show the Israeli courts that Israeli judgments would generally be enforced in the UAE, and assuming all of the other preconditions for enforcement are met, which are generally more procedural things, that the award is final, that there were no issues with jurisdiction, the usual things you'd expect in most countries, then I would expect that enforcement would be possible. The second thing I wanted to mention is that, interestingly, I mentioned the DIFC courts. So I know that there's at least one judgment in the DIFC court with an Israeli party. It's a relatively small case, but at least there's the first time that an Israeli party has been there. The Israeli party actually lost, but still, it looks like it lost on the merits, and there was a hearing and decision rendered. So it'll be interesting to hear. It will be interesting to see where that goes, and whether there will be more Israeli parties involved in litigation in the Emirates and in other countries, and vice versa. So, Professor Reich, Stu, if you have anything to add on these issues, if not, I think we can move to Stu, who, as I mentioned, we'll hear from him about in another Abraham Accords country, which is Sudan, and its kind of more unique or different path into the Abraham Accords, and maybe a more troubled history, at least with Israel, than some of the other Abraham Accord countries.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from around the world, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting and timely discussion. I'm not going to be able to show you a modern skyline of what's going on in Khartoum, Sudan right now. They don't have a skyline. It's not Dubai or Abu Dhabi. It's not Tel Aviv. It's not Morocco. It's not Bahrain. It's not anything like most of the people on this call might imagine. As we all know, because it's on the front page of the news today, Khartoum and Sudan are in a terrible crisis right now, effectively a civil war between competing military factions. Hundreds of thousands of refugees trying to leave, poverty, people being killed and injured, forced from their homes. It's a terrible situation. And sadly, we shouldn't be surprised because the history of Sudan, very, very different from the history of the other members of the Abraham Accords. As we know, Morocco, Bahrain, the Emirates, and others, both in the Arab world and more broadly, some have been, very transparent in their dealings with Israel on the economic and political and diplomatic front. Egypt and Jordan, of course, had formal treaties, and Morocco, the Emirates, Bahrain, have been dealing with Israel kind of more quietly, if you will, on lots of levels for many, many years. Sudan, of course, is a very, very different situation. For those who need, particularly for the younger people, who need a brief history lesson, ironically, Israel and Sudan were both parts of the British mandates. Israel, of course, losing the mandate in 1948 and Sudan in the mid-1950s, I believe 1956. So they actually share a little bit of history as both having been subjects of the British Empire until recent memory. But that's where the overlap really ends. In August of 1967, right after the June 1967 Six-Day War that really changed the geographic and political map of the Middle East and the war, the Arab League met very famously in Khartoum, Sudan, and issued what is very famously known as the 3 no's. No negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no peace treaties with Israel. And the famous 3 no's Arab League conference in Khartoum of the August 1967 really was the foundation of Arab boycotts economically, not just politically, of Israel. Of course, we saw in the early 70s after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the real boycott, the Arab oil boycott of the West and all that sort of thing. So if we're looking at dispute, not just militarily, but economic, Khartoum really was sort of a starting point for much of that for the entire North Africa, Middle East region. But in the 1980s, things really went, as they say, in a different direction in Sudan, as it relations not just to Israel, but the entire Middle East. When General Bashir took over the country in a coup, he turned Sudan into not just a confrontation state with Israel, meaning they actually sent soldiers to fight Israel in wars, unlike the Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain, but it also became a terrorist state. And in the 1980s and into the 1990s, Bashir and Sudan welcomed and supported Al-Qaeda and indeed Osama bin Laden, who lived in Khartoum, had businesses in Khartoum, and was closely associated with the Bashir regime right into the 1990s. Now, how did I get involved in all this? Well, unfortunately, and because a lot of this is the nature of my practice, on August 7, 1998, Al-Qaeda carried out 2 suicide truck bombings of the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Hundreds of people were killed, not just Americans, but Kenyans and Tanzanians and others. And for many, many years, I represented all the American victims and their families who were killed in those attacks. Who did we sue? We sued Sudan because Sudan was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, a formal legal and regulatory term that allowed first Americans and then non-Americans who were employed by the US government to pursue Sudan and other countries like Libya, Iran, and others in federal court in Washington for damages. And Sudan represented itself. There was a few years where it withdrew representation, but it hired major law firms. Eventually, White & Case represented them as we got further along in the litigation. And I was not the only law firm involved. Gibson Dunn was involved on our side and some others. And we pursued Sudan in federal court. We obtained judgments for its role in supporting Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in these attacks on our embassies. And eventually, we obtained judgments. The judgments were upheld on appeal. The cases went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which affirmed all the judgments. Sudan defending itself through White and Case through the whole process. And during this time, meaning almost a 20-year period, Israel and Sudan were effectively at war with each other. Because after al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden kind of migrated from Sudan to Afghanistan, Iran started using Sudan as a base to transport weapons and missiles through Sudan, through the very porous Egyptian border with Sudan, to supply weapons and missiles to Hamas in Gaza, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and other terrorist groups in the region, much to the dismay, not just of Israel, but Egypt, Jordan, Saudis, and many others, and the Emirates, I might add. During that time frame, the Israeli Air Force actually carried out military raids on Khartoum as recently as 10 years ago. And they didn't get a lot of attention in the press. And when they happened, General Bashir and his regime tried to say, oh, that was just a fire at a warehouse or a truck blew up or something like that. And so we have a very different history here, a very different path of how Sudan eventually joined the Abraham Accords. And you'd say, well, how could a terrorist state, a confrontation state, even think about doing such a thing? Well, the lawsuits that we handled didn't just result in court judgments. Eventually, after we had finished going all the way up to the US Supreme Court, Sudan and we, with the diplomatic assistance of the Emirates and Israel, helped the US not only to get Sudan to settle our cases, which they did, they paid in a international bilateral settlement agreement between the United States and Sudan, hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation to my clients and others who were pursuing them. It was a historic settlement. It was based very much on the model of the US-Libya settlement, which was back in 2008, which gained a little more press than the Sudan settlement. And we even had to go to Congress to get legislation to implement this international settlement agreement. It was during that process, which was very intense, as you can imagine, and very politically crazy, that Sudan agreed after General Bashir had been thrown out of office, where he now sits in a Sudanese jail, awaiting who knows what kind of legal consequences, that the Sudanese government agreed that Sudan would join the Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain in joining the Abraham Accords. Why? Unlike the Emirates, Sudan doesn't have gas and oil. Unlike Morocco, it does not have a history of large numbers of Moroccan Jews moving to Israel or having kept ties with Morocco. Unlike Bahrain, there isn't a U.S. military base in Sudan that plays a major role in its decisions. Sudan didn't have any of these things. It does have one thing that's important to the Arab world and, frankly, important to Israel. It's a large agricultural country. It grows a lot of crops. It has a lot of cattle and livestock. It helps feed Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. And quite often, Sudan will, even though it's smaller than it used to be, remember, the bottom half of the country was broken off into South Sudan over a dozen years ago. It's still a regional supplier of food and livestock, mostly to the Gulf and the Saudis. To Sudan, having Israeli agricultural tech, which is some of the best in the world, how to better conserve water resources, how to better get yields from crops and livestock, could make a tremendous difference to the people of Sudan in terms of how much food they have, trying to reduce food scarcity, and also helping Sudan increase its exports of agricultural products to its traditional customers in the Middle East and the Gulf. And so the Israelis were thrilled, A, to see a state that had been a terrorist state and indeed a confrontation state become basically a partner for peace, if you will, where both parties, both states could benefit economically, diplomatically, and as most points in diplomacy, both parties have to have benefits. Both parties have to see that their interests are served by engaging in this sort of thing. Now, obviously, Sudan is not as far along as the Emirates. You won't see a chart like we saw a minute ago from my colleague about hundreds of thousands of Israelis traveling to Khartoum as tourists. You will not see a chart showing billions of dollars of trade for high tech and medical and all that sort of thing. You won't see daily flights from Tel Aviv to Khartoum. We're not there yet, putting aside the terrible civil strife that's going on in Sudan. What we're hopeful, though, is that this is a roadmap for how a state, which had been a confrontation state and a terrorist state, can overcome that history and try to reach out for common ground with Israel, with the support of its Arab neighbors, because Egypt and the Saudis and the Emirates and the Jordanians were all very supportive of Sudan working with the context of the Abraham Accords in a way that would make sense for everyone in the region. Now, we don't know what the future holds in Sudan. We're all praying that the strife that's going on right now can be ended. Press reports have shown that representatives of Israel have been in Khartoum talking to both sides in this civil strife. And both sides have been meeting with Israeli representatives. And so hopefully Israel quietly can work with the Saudis, can work with the Americans, can work with other parties to bring this strife to an end and get Sudan back on track in its own unique way, in its own very different way than the success story we've seen with the Emirates and Morocco. And as Professor Reich will know and show us in a minute, even Lebanon, which is effectively controlled by Hezbollah and Iran, okay, militarily and diplomatically and economically, has somehow found a way to resolve the maritime border disputes to allow the gas to be developed by Israel and Lebanon and other countries like Cyprus. So if that can be done on a large scale between Lebanon and Israel in its own unique way, certainly Sudan, which has already taken steps to join the Abraham Accords, can and hopefully will, a couple of years from now, allow people to put up graphs that show progress between Israel and Sudan, just like we've seen with others. So I hope that kind of summarizes things of this very unique path that Sudan has taken and continues to take as part of the Abraham Accords. Thank you. And anyone who has questions, of course, at the end, we're happy to try to answer them.
Thank you. I think that was very interesting and probably a much less well-known aspect of the Abraham Accords. And hopefully, if we have a similar panel in a year or two or three, we can talk about a few other interesting states that will join the Accords and kind of there's the story about their path to it. Ari, Professor Rai, turn over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to share this presentation. I was supposed to talk about two topics, completely unrelated. One is the fact that Israel's Ministry of Justice has decided that Israel should adopt the UNCITRAL model law on international commercial arbitration, and that to a certain extent they have credited me for convincing them to do so through an article that I published a few years back, and also I organized a conference bringing the UNCITRAL Secretary General here to Bar-Ilan University, and we all hope that it's going to go through the Knesset or Parliament and become law, and that will certainly make a big difference in Israel in furthering international commercial arbitration in Israel, and Israel is serving as a seat for international commercial arbitration, and hopefully that will happen soon. And we already now see many changes in the local scene of the law firms being much more involved in this field and being specializing in it more and more than we knew before. So that was one topic. And the other topic, which I'm going to devote most of my time to, is what you see here on the screen, the Israel-Lebanon maritime border dispute. And I think that also has given a big contribution to stability in the region and peace. And indeed, this agreement that was reached in October 2022, just a few months ago, is an historic agreement. It's historic on many counts. First of all, I think it's probably the first maritime boundary agreement ever in history that has been reached between countries that have no diplomatic relations, and as you called it, confrontational states, countries that still today are to a certain extent at war and have been in war. And not only that, but what is paradoxical is that actually the land border between these two states is still disputed. It's what we have the border that's called the Blue Line, which is administered by the United Nations, but there are certain places where it's still disputed. This is also the first maritime delimitation agreement between adjacent states in East Mediterranean. So until now, we've had such agreements between countries that are opposite each other on the other side of the Mediterranean, so to speak, such as Egypt and Cyprus, Israel and Cyprus. But this is the first ever agreement between two countries that have a land border between them. And it was reached through indirect negotiations that was mediated by the United States. And since here we are all interested in dispute settlement, this is not arbitration, but it's dispute settlement. It's really interesting how this was done between two countries that won't even sit with each other. So they were basically sitting in two separate rooms, and the U.S. mediator was doing the talking between them. And the agreement is not one agreement, it's actually two agreements. It's two agreements, one between Israel and the United States, and the other one between Lebanon and the United States, which obviously both these are countries that do recognize each other, but altogether they constitute an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. And as you know, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties in Article 2.1 defines an international treaty that it can be constituted by one or two or more agreements. So here we fall in the second category of two agreements that together constitute one agreement between Israel and Lebanon without them actually sitting together. That's kind of unique, I would say. So what was the dispute about? So this dispute has been going on since 2010. So it took 12 years basically to settle it. And in 2011, both countries submitted border claims to the UN, but they were conflicting. They weren't the same. So Israel, if you look at the map here, you can see the border between Israel and Lebanon is called in Hebrew Rosh HaNikra, in English Nakura, in Arabic Nakura. And according to Israel, the line should go 90 degrees from the baseline that goes along the coast, and until it hits a point here where you can see it's in white, Israel Maritime Claim. This point here is called point 1. As opposed to Lebanon, which it submitted its claim with a line that goes more to the south, to another point, which is called point 25. The end of this is basically the delimitation, the border with Cyprus, because if further into the Mediterranean, we have the Cyprus. And actually both Lebanon and Israel reached an agreement with Cyprus. Mind you, the Lebanese agreement was only signed, never ratified. So Israel said, you know, in your agreement, Lebanon, with Cyprus, you also indicated this point 1 as the point that appears on the maps of your delimitation agreement with Cyprus. So you basically conceded that this is the point. But then the Lebanese say, yeah, but this agreement was never ratified, so we don't agree. And so within this triangle that is created by these two disputing claims, we have a total area of 856 square kilometer. At a later point, as part of the negotiation, I would say part of a trick, and manipulation in the negotiation, Lebanon said, no, actually, we're claiming much more. And then they came up and said that we have this new idea that actually you should draw the line as a continuation of the land border. So if you draw the land border straight into the sea, you kind of reach this, but then they understood that they have to go up a little bit further up north, and so they came up with this claim. But this, everybody knew that this was kind of a manipulations part of the negotiations. Anyway, what's important to know is that Israel has here a confirmed, found natural gas field called Karish, which is now owned by the Greek company Energean. And it was supposed to start working in 2020. Lebanon, on the other hand, has this prospect called the Kana prospect, where there is a high chance to finding gas, although it's not 100% clear yet that there is there. Another important thing to know is that in 2003, Israel laid buoys in the water in order to delimitate the border, the maritime border between the territorial waters of Lebanon on the one hand and Israel. Why only 5 kilometers? Because afterward it became too deep to put buoys. That's what was explained to me. Now, when did this whole thing start to become really, really urgent? When in 2020, Israel was bound to stop developing the Karish field. And on the other hand, Lebanon granted licenses in this Kana prospect to international companies such as Total and Eni from Italy and Novatek. And part of it was in the disputed waters, in the so-called exclusive economic zone, in the economic waters of Israel. And this is a big problem. And also the international companies won't put money into the siege, so to speak, for exploration if they don't have predictability and stability in knowing that this actually belongs to them, that Lebanon has the authority to give them a license in this area. Israel, of course, protested these licenses. And as a result, the United States' efforts to mediate went into a higher level and phase. This was done by American missionary Amos Hochstein, who actually originally is Israeli. And it was done in the UNIFIL headquarters in Akura on the border. Again, as I said, without the parties actually meeting, sitting in separate rooms. And eventually the agreement was signed in October 2022. How was it possible to reach the agreement? So I think there was a bit of luck here. The situation, the circumstances were really special at the time. On the one hand, we had in Israel a temporary government, a transitional government headed by Yair Lapid, who had maybe a month to go before the general elections. On the Lebanese side, on the one hand, their economic situation, political situation is catastrophic and still is. And to be able to explore and maybe find natural gas was a big ray of hope for the Lebanese, but they couldn't do so as long as this dispute wasn't settled. And add to that the fact that the Lebanese president was on his last few weeks before his term was over. And add to that also threats by Hezbollah to prevent the starting of drawing gas from the Karish field. All these circumstances came together and made it very, very urgent to finish this. And as a result, the U.S. mediation efforts were successful, and the agreement, or I should say the agreements, were signed in October 2022. So what's in the agreement? It's in the agreement is that Lebanon recognizes de facto the 5-kilometer buoy line as delimiting the territorial waters of the party. But from then on, first of all, there's a question because territorial waters are 12 nautical miles, which means about 20 kilometers. So only 5 kilometers out of the territorial waters have been delimited. That's a big question. But from there on, it seems that the line is taking a little bit of a turn to the north, to the south, as demanded by Lebanon. And in fact, that raised a lot of criticism within Israel by the then opposition, which today is the governing government, the Likud party, and the other right-wing party, that this was really a sell-off. This was a capitulation by the more left-wing or center-wing leaning government, because basically they accepted all of Lebanese demands. On the other hand, Israel said that we are more interested in, or that the government at the time said, we're more interested in settling this. It's important to settling it from a security point of view. What was agreed also, what this Kana prospect will be exploited under Lebanese law. So they will grant a license, they will run the whole show, but Israel will retain economic rights according to the parts in its water. So you can see here that there's like a small green triangle here. So they will basically, whatever, if there is found gas or oil there, whatever part is in that green triangle, in other words, inside Israeli economic zone, Israel will be entitled to royalties on that share. So basically what we will have here is what we call a unitization agreement between the companies that will hopefully find this gas and the Israeli government, again, under the auspices and help and assistance of the United States government. And I should also note that the United States government has also granted like a guarantee to Israel that this will be honored, that the agreement will be honored and not violated, and also the peace will remain. So Karish remains Israeli, of course, and there is a dispute settlement provision in the agreement, but it's not a definite one. It basically says that any dispute will be resolved through discussions facilitated by the United States. So in potential theory, we could have here a serious dispute that has no binding mechanism to resolve it. I hope we won't get there, and that U.S. involvement here will solve this problem, just as it brought us to this agreement. But the agreement, and I will conclude with that, is very important because it really provides the necessary stability for gas and oil exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean. Potential for military clashes, terrorism has been decreased, reduced significantly. And this agreement, as I said, which is an historic agreement, together with the Abraham Accords, I think it paves the way for involvement of more and more energy cooperation in the region. We already have energy cooperation, but I think this paves the way for more of it. And already now we know that there is a company from Abu Dhabi which is interested in entering the Israeli natural gas exploration market, and this could be an opening for more and more economic cooperation. And of course, I think also that in the end of the day, improvement of Lebanon's very dire economic situation is in Israel's interest, because it could free them from the control that was mentioned before of the Hezbollah, of Iran, not free them, but maybe reduce a bit the control that the stronghold that is held now by these animals, these countries and terror organization, and be able to maybe in the further future maybe pave the way for some kind of peace between Israel and Lebanon. And again, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think I've seen questions from the audience. Paul, Stu, is there anything either of you want to add about any of the things we've been discussing here today?
The only thing I would add, and it comes through on this presentation and others we've done, is that it's not one size fits all when it comes to Israel and its neighbors in the North Africa, Middle East, Gulf region. As Professor Wright just pointed out, Lebanon, which is, maybe the ultimate confrontation state de facto with Israel at the moment because of Hezbollah, even they were able to put together what could be a multi-billion-dollar economic arrangement, albeit non-traditional. The way Sudan got there, non-traditional. And I think the takeaway from here is, as wonderful as we see the charts with the Emirates and tourism and trade, and then we know Morocco, Bahrain are on that path. When Sudan and Lebanon, in their own unique ways, can find a path forward, either for political or economic reasons, to find ways that are not involving soldiers and airplanes and bombings and killings to resolve disputes, the better. And that's where lawyers and economic people and experts like those who are participating in these conferences can really help the process for peace in a constructive and positive way. I think that's the takeaway from all of this. And it's not one size fits all.
Thank you. So I agree with that. And I think it's really interesting. I read, I've been following their publications, and I read again before today the 2022 annual report of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute, which is interesting and kind of goes through the different states and how each one is a bit different. And it actually ranks the strength of the peace within the Abraham Accords countries by its relative strength, so strong, adequate, etc. And it also discusses, interestingly, kind of prospects for additional states in the Middle East, Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. So for anyone who has interest in reading more and seeing the diplomatic, people-to-people, economic, and other aspects of this, can certainly read that report. And then just another recommendation, again, no connection to them, but the LinkedIn and other pages of the diplomatic missions of the different countries. I know I follow, for example, the Israeli missions to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and then the information they post is always interesting. So unless we have anything else from the panelists or from the audience, I'll turn it over to the organizers, to Ian, Maria, and others to kind of guide us going forward.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. That's been a fantastic panel. Actually, I had a few questions. I could interject. We've got a couple of more minutes. What are the prospects for additional countries to join the Accord? I know there's been, a lot of, frankly, economic activity in the region. Certainly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait are potential candidates as well. And of course, arbitration has been on an incredible growth rate. What do you think the prospects are for those other Gulf countries to join? Paul, Ari?
So there was around, I think, the middle of last year, there were strong rumors about Saudi joining. That seems to have gone cold or quiet. That would be massive, obviously, if Saudi, the economic powerhouse of the region, home of all the Mecca and Medina, etc. So that would be huge. I understand the Saudis are looking at something less sort of public. So I think looking at maybe a land route from Israel to the UAE, for example, which would have to go over Saudi land, and I think that needs Jordanian permission as well. Again, I think, as I understand, that would be the only road out of Israel, so then that would be huge again. So I think that's more likely from the Saudis than a full-on treaty. And then for the others, I've not even heard any whispers. Oman's, I'm surprised Oman maybe isn't looking at this, and yeah, I don't think there are any others right at the moment. Anyone else aware of anything? Ari, Stu, Leah?
Go ahead,
Well,
Ari.
I think one of the lessons from the Lebanese agreement is that you kind of need the right constellation of situation for it to happen. I mean, obviously, Saudi Arabia is the great prize out there for an Abrahamic Accord, and there's been a lot of talk about it. But I agree with Paul that right now it is less likely to happen, and partly because of the right-wing government that we have now in Israel, which is perceived as quite extreme, and with all kinds of statements that are problematic for a country such as Saudi, which considers itself as kind of a leader of the Muslim world. But again, things could change at some point in the future, and once the right circumstances are in place and an agreement is reached, then usually once it's there, it stays there, even if situation changes. So that is one option. There are also other big Islamic states, which there is potential, I think, again, in the right circumstances, such as Indonesia, maybe even Malaysia, although less, maybe Pakistan. Right now, it's not on the table, but it could happen. And that would, I mean, already now travel from Israel to Indonesia is allowed, and it could develop in the future.
Yeah, and let me just add what Paul and Ari say is all correct. One of the things, instead of just saying, well, when is Saudi going to sign the Abraham Accords? I think that's not the right question to ask. It's what's going on now that is building the framework, the foundation for Saudi and others, but Saudi in particular. And it's the small steps that are going on either informally or behind the scenes that create the infrastructure that would allow Saudi to do it when, quote, the stars are aligned, as Ari says. There is extensive security cooperation between Israel and Saudi already. This has been reported publicly. There is extensive, so I'll call it under the table economic exchanges going on between Israel and the Saudi. Israeli technology is showing up in Saudi Arabia. I'll just, not directly, indirectly, going through third parties. So you're seeing that. Just this week, it's been revealed that the Saudis may allow Israeli Arabs who are Muslim to travel directly from Ben Gurion Airport to Mecca and Medina for the Hajj, which would be a very significant thing. So when you see partial steps, just like when Qatar allowed direct flights of soccer fans, football fans from Tel Aviv to Doha last year for the World Cup. So I think you're more likely to see step by step rather than a dramatic Abraham Accords type of a signing ceremony, if you will. That's going to have to wait for what my friend Ari says. The political stars have to be aligned in all the parties for that to happen. The last thing I'll say is the de facto ruler of Saudi, MBS, as he's called themselves, Mohammed bin Salman, he said just this week, we're prepared to move ahead with Israel, but, we think the Palestinian-Israel issue needs to be resolved. Now, in the past, and frankly, I think today, that's a fig leaf. That is a political statement that's used to justify going slow, even while Saudi and Israel are engaged in many substantive exchanges. And so I think a lot of things have to happen step by step over the next maybe couple of years, not just in Israel politically, will this government survive or not, but also what happens in Saudi, what happens around the world, what role is Iran playing, with Saudi and Iran taking baby steps towards each other to reduce their tensions. All of those things will be taken into account by the time that Saudi and Israel may be able to announce they've now entered into the Abraham Accord. So we'll see what happens. We can all pray that it goes the path of positive development and not negative.
I see we have a question in the chat whether there's any lessons from the Abraham Accord that can be used to end Russia's Ukraine war. Well, that's quite a different situation, I would say, because there we're in the middle of a war. And as was mentioned before by Nir, there was never any war, direct war, at least not with the Emirates. And a lot of things were going on behind the scene. Here, it's much more problematic, and it's, I don't know, I can't see how exactly, but the situation is so different, and it's a lot of matter of prestige going on there, and nationalism and national pride for Russia to concede that it has not been very successful as it thought in its attack. And I don't know, it will take a very long time for that to happen, especially in a totalitarian regime as is now in place there. But maybe somebody else has some take on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there's very little parallels to draw. Maybe the only thing is that the importance of a strong, relevant third-party mediator to help drive along kind of diplomatic progress, which is also something that's probably been missing a bit in the Ukraine-Russia situation. I think surprisingly, Israel tried to take that role early on in that conflict, but I think that has kind of been less of the situation more recently. So maybe that's the only one parallel. I don't know if it's parallel, but lesson that I think you can see from the Abraham Accords. But other than that, I think I agree, those are very, very different situations.
It's I call it the reverse Abraham Accords. There are bits between Ukraine and Russia. They had full diplomatic relations. They were close culturally, economically, language-wise, I mean, historically. So it's the complete reverse of the Abraham Accords. It's like, it's like an alternative universe. Yeah. But the lesson from the Abraham Accords is that former enemies can find ways to work together. Okay, and that's the most important. I mean, we're talking big picture dispute resolution. That's the message to take away.
Well, and maybe on that note, we've come to the end of our time, and I wanted to thank Nir and Ari and Stu and Paul for this excellent and enlightening panel. Arbitration in the Middle East, North Africa, and Israel has grown rapidly over the last 10-15 years. The economic activities that have now occurred over the last few years between Israel and many of its former antagonists is heartening in a world that in many places continues to still be hostile. It's a great lesson for all of us, and this was a great panel to start off this week in World Arbitration Update, and we're going to have another panel at the top of the hour titled "The Protocol on Investment of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, USMCA, and New Generation of Investment Treaties by Region." And I invite everyone to come back at the top of the hour right now we're going to break out into discussion rooms as one of the features of World Arbitration Update. We like to provide a little bit of networking. So for those of you who want to stay on and have a chat with some of your colleagues, we'll provide that opportunity. But otherwise, we'll see you at the next session. And thanks again to our panelists and moderator for a great discussion on the Abraham Accords. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you very, very much. Very useful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.